heard that Donald Trump wants to go to war in Venezuela. You want to guess? You want to guess which year that was?
Oh no!
It wasn't any time recently. That's in here. It's in this book.
I have to tell you, just Lawrence, I'm going to let you go. I have watched all of the Andrew McCabe interviews. I have looked at everything that has been published about his book. The interview I have been most excited about is this one you're about to do.
You know why?
God, man, I'm very excited.
You know why? Because it's going to be two Irish guys sitting around talking about Jeff Sessions.
Go to it.
That's why.
Go. Thanks, Lawrence.
Well, in an investigative report released today by 4 New York Times reporters, the New York Times summarized what they described as President Trump's 2-year war on the investigations encircling him. That war has included attacks by the president on our first guest tonight, Andrew McCabe, and his wife. Much of the Times report today is a cohesive assembly of most of it is of things that we already know and have already been revealed about the president's war on the investigations and the investigators, including special counsel Robert Mueller and his staff. But the lead item in the Times report shows the president once again stepping up to the line, if not crossing the line, of obstruction of justice. The Times reports that shortly after firing Attorney General Jeff Sessions, the president called Matthew G. Whitaker, his newly installed Attorney General, with a question. He asked whether Jeffrey Berman, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York and a Trump ally, could be put in charge of the widening investigation. That was, of course, a widening investigation in which the President of the United States had already been effectively named an unindicted co-conspirator in federal court in Manhattan, an unindicted co-conspirator who committed crimes with Michael Cohen and ordered Michael Cohen to commit crimes in arranging payoffs for the silence of 2 women in the final days of the presidential campaign. The problem for the president was that Jeffrey Berman, who the president appointed as the top federal prosecutor in Manhattan, had already recused himself from any investigation involving the president. So Jeffrey Berman could not do what Andrew McCabe says President Trump expects from federal prosecutors who he appoints. Jeffrey Berman could not protect Donald Trump. In his book, Andrew McCabe writes that what he knows about President Trump, asking then FBI Director James Comey to drop the investigation of Donald Trump's first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, who has pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. He writes this: after Comey's conversation with the president, he called me on the phone to tell me what Trump said. This was the moment when I realized that the president and his administration were not just inexperienced, not just unfamiliar with the established norms of democratic government. They wished to manipulate the functions of government mainly for their own interests. And joining us now, the author of that passage and the book, The Threat: How the FBI Protects America in the Age of Terror and Trump, the former deputy director of the FBI, who, after the firing of James Comey, became the acting director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I know you've been through a bunch of these television discussions. And I want to go, let's start actually with the breaking news of the night, which is Jeffrey Rosen and this question of what kind of experience should a deputy attorney general have. And apparently Jeffrey Rosen has served in the Bush administration, served in the Trump administration, but not in any capacity near the criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lawrence, I don't know Mr. Rosen, so it wouldn't be proper for me to speak about his abilities or how he will do in the job. But I will say this: I've had the opportunity to work very closely with several deputy attorneys general, and it is without a doubt one of the hardest jobs I think that you could find yourself in Washington. The Deputy Attorney General essentially runs the day-to-day functioning of the department, oversees all of its operational capacity, all of the investigations that take place across not just the department, but all of its component groups. It is an enormous responsibility. So he will very quickly find himself in a super challenging position, and one that will require him to immediately start making some very tough decisions. For instance, as we approach whatever phase Director Mueller is in his ongoing investigation, the continued protection and support of that investigation which is so important to this country and to the work we expect
But
to see.
isn't that Attorney General Barr's job now?
It will be. Attorney General Barr will have ultimate authority over those things, but on a day-to-day level, the Deputy Attorney General will be the person likely to be first interacting with Director Mueller.
And also to the New York Times report tonight that the president called up Matthew Whitaker when he became the so-called acting Attorney General and asked if basically he could change prosecutors in New York and restore the guy he appointed who had already been recused from this. And apparently Matthew Whitaker somehow got it through to the president that you can't do that. Your reaction to that? Any reader of your book will not be surprised by that and will expect that we will, over time, discover more and more such phone calls Donald Trump has made around the administration.
Right. So it's not surprising at all, right? Especially when you're familiar with the history that we went through in May of 2017. It's not that different from asking Director Comey to just let go of the investigation of Mike Flynn. Of course, one of the crucial steps that caused us to believe that this president might, in fact, be trying to obstruct justice. So it's not surprising. The reporting in the Times today, but it is incredibly alarming, and it's something that the people in this country should be focused on, should be asking questions about. It cuts to the very heart of the issue that I refer to in the threat, and that is the behavior of this president, statements of this president, his administration, and his supporters on the Hill are on a daily basis undermining the institutions we count on to preserve a free and fair society in this country.
The president is, as operationally as a president, is new to all of us. We saw the campaign. It looked pretty crazy. It turns out the Trump presidency is pretty crazy too. But what maybe some of us thought we could predict would be the behavior of what you just referred to, which is the Trump allies on Capitol Hill, Republican senators, for example, like Lindsey Graham and others, who have surprised me. Mitch McConnell has surprised me in his fealty to Donald Trump. Has that been surprising to you, to see the way Republican senators have gotten in line with President Trump?
It's been surprising to me for quite some time. I mean, it's surprising to me the things that take place day in, day out, and took place in the previous Congress that provoked no oversight reaction and no critical response on the Hill whatsoever. So, yeah, I think those are things that cause all people who track these events and watch what's happening to scratch their heads and say, why is this happening? Why is nobody standing up to call out this aberrant, norm-busting behavior?
There's a dramatic scene in the book that you've talked about also publicly about a meeting with the Gang of Eight. The Gang of Eight is the shorthand for the leaders of the intelligence committees in the House and the Senate, both Republican and Democratic leaders. There they are, the ones who were in the meeting you were in, and the leaders of each body, leaders of the House, leaders of the Senate. In this meeting in the Gang of Eight, you're telling them that you have ordered a counterintelligence investigation of the President of the United States. And I just want to follow up on how you described that this morning on the Today Show with Savannah Guthrie. In that description that you gave them, did you make it clear to them that this is a counterintelligence investigation of Donald Trump? And did you provide them with any evidence that, in effect, launched this investigation?
So I don't want to go into too much detail about exactly what we discussed in that briefing. I want to be respectful of the fact that those communications between the leaders of the department and the leaders on the Hill are things that we respect in terms of being confidential.
Can I just pause you over that for a second? Because this book had to be vetted by the FBI.
It did.
And so in the vetting process, is this kind of limitation that you've just announced in response to this question something you're imposing on yourself, or was that a limitation imposed by the vetting process of the FBI?
Well, I mean, any former government official who had a high-level security clearance is expected to continue to observe those restrictions. You're expected to continue to protect sensitive and certainly classified information and your knowledge of it for the rest of your life. So it's a kind of the two sides of the same process. I did go through an extensive vetting process. They call it pre-publication review with the FBI. It was a robust back and forth for quite a few months. But I'm very happy with the product that came out of that, and glad to have the FBI's seal of approval on it.
So in the meeting with the Gang of Eight, and I actually would like to put the picture up again because I think it's important for the audience to understand who was in this room with you. Because what you're reporting in the book is that Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and Devin Nunes, who was in that meeting, and in the book that unsettled you a great deal, Richard Burr, all of these Republicans listened to what you had to say about launching an investigation of the President of the United States. And none of them asked a single question about it or raised any issue of resistance to that investigation?
Lawrence, there was no resistance whatsoever. The purpose of the briefing was to brief them on the steps we had taken. I also walked them through the history, how we had gotten to the point where we were at that place and time, and then to brief them on the steps that I had taken during that week. It was the same briefing in which Rod Rosenstein announced to the leadership that he had appointed a special counsel. But at the conclusion of my remarks, there were no objections. There were no protests. There was no, there was a clear sense in the room that people were resigned to the fact that we had taken a necessary step. That was my impression.
One of the people in the room, Kevin McCarthy, was recorded on an audio recording during the presidential campaign, saying that he personally believed that Donald Trump took money from Vladimir Putin. So that was Kevin McCarthy, who was in the room with you that day. And so there's plenty of reason why someone like Kevin McCarthy, on his own, what we now know to be what he has said about Donald Trump, that he wouldn't be surprised. But Devin Nunes was in the room. And you and Rod Rosenstein, as you entered the room, had a conversation. You signaled to each other that this was very uncomfortable to you that Devin Nunes was in the room. In the book, you describe Rod Rosenstein having some kind of conversation with Devin Nunes. Did he try to get Devin Nunes to leave the room?
It's my understanding he raised with Representative Nunes the understanding that we all had, which was that he had recused from, because of his own issues, had recused from weighing in on having anything to do with the Russia investigation. The Deputy Attorney General came back to speak to me after his interaction. He said the recusal is his to administer. These are his choices to make. We essentially were not in a position to, remove him or refuse to include him in the briefing, and so he chose to stay.
You talk about a briefing of the president that you weren't part of, but it was an FBI official who went to brief the president, a rare requested briefing by the president about Russian sanctions. The briefer comes back to you and you describe him in the book. You say he was dumbfounded when he, as a result of being in this briefing with the president. He said that the president talked nonstop. He described all that. The president changed the subject to North Korea because North Korea had recently been reported to have tested an intercontinental ballistic missile. What did the president then say to the briefer about that North Korean test?
The president told everyone in the room that he didn't think the North Koreans had actually launched the missiles that we had all seen. He didn't think that the North Koreans had the capacity to launch those missiles, and he didn't think they did because he'd been told that by the president of Russia.
And the next passage down in the book has been, I think, ignored just by about everyone who's talked to you about it. The very next passage in the book, in the very same briefing, the president says to the briefer that he wants to have a war with Venezuela, and this is in 2017.
Yeah, the president's remarks to the room were along the lines of, I don't understand why we're not looking at Venezuela. Why are we not at war with Venezuela? They have all the oil and they're right on our back door. So I can't put myself in the president's mind. I can't say how, clearly crystallize, how clearly his intent had crystallized. But these were comments that caused us deep concern. They were incredibly troubling, especially to two people who had been sent down there to talk to him about the two Russian dachas and the FBI position with respect to whether or not those properties had been used for recreation or intelligence gathering by the Russians. It was a head-spinning and dumbfounding moment. It caused us all to step back and engage in a question that I think bedevils the intelligence community to this day, and that is, how do you get effective intelligence and information to this president? How do you get his attention? How do you get him to consume these products in a way that'll help him make decisions? We were frustrated by
There's
that.
something so strange in the moment, though, that here is someone who eventually there is the strong suspicion to the point of an investigation that he is worthy of a counterintelligence investigation. And it's his relationship to Russia. That person is willing to say in front of all of these people, including an official from the FBI, that I believe Vladimir Putin. He told me that that North Korea doesn't have these missiles, and I believe him. Isn't there a crazy innocence in that this person would confess this, say this out loud? I get my information from Vladimir Putin.
I'll agree with you that it's crazy. I don't know that I'll agree with you that it's innocent. It is it's dumbfounding. It's dumbfounding. So put yourself in the position of those intelligence officers, right? So they are trying desperately to get the president's attention. They are trying to convey products that they think will be effective in forming his thoughts on these issues. And not only is that failing, not only is he seems to be embracing a conclusion that's not supported by any of our intelligence. He says that he believes the words and the advice and the direction of our adversary over those very intelligence officials. It's concerning, it's troubling, but it's incredibly dispiriting to that workforce that applies themselves so diligently to this day to trying to produce intelligence for our decision makers.
Well, we have to go to a break when we come back. I think everyone who's ever worked in government who's had an actual business meeting in the Oval Office remembers their first.
Of course.
I remember mine. It was about tax policy, a tax bill with President Clinton. Yours, in this book, is the single strangest first business meeting, I believe, anyone's ever had in the Oval Office. We're going to go over that when we come back after this break. We'll be right back. We are back with the former acting director of the FBI and the author of the new book, The Threat: How the FBI Protects America in the Age of Terror and Trump. Andrew McCabe is back with us. And in the book, you describe your first visit to the Oval Office to see President Trump, which was your first business visit to the Oval Office. You once stood at the doorway on a tour and looked across the velvet rope.
That's right.
That's the closest you'd gotten. But you described it as your loyalty test.
That's right. That's right. As soon as I came into the room, the president, he's an overwhelming communicator. He stood up, came over to me, shook my hand, and immediately launched into kind of a monologue on how great things were. And it was terrific that they had fired the FBI director and how people were so happy about that. This was not what I was seeing in my own building. People were clearly in a state of shock. And then he said to me, I heard you were part of the resistance. And I thought, I'm not sure what you mean by that, sir. And I said exactly that to him. And he said, I heard that you were one of those people who didn't agree with Jim Comey and didn't support the decisions he made. And, you weren't a part of that team. I said, no, sir, that's not true. I worked very closely with Director Comey, and I was a part of all those decisions. If you're referring to the Clinton email case, I was a part of those decisions last summer. I knew right then I hadn't given him the answer he was looking for, and so we kind of got off on that very awkward foot shortly after I stepped into the room.
You write in the book that fear is why he asks people to pledge personal loyalty.
I think that's true. This is something that I was first became familiar with working organized crime cases in New York. What I saw in the Oval Office was not dissimilar to the same sort of statements and manipulation and that obsessive focus on loyalty, and not loyalty in the way we think of loyalty as loyalty to country and loyalty to purpose and mission, but loyalty in terms of, are you with me or are you against me? Are you on my team or are you one of the enemy? And I think the president, it was my own experience, that is his instinctive reaction in the same way that the leader of a criminal enterprise or a mob boss is constantly assessing the loyalty of those soldiers and people around him because it's essential to his own existence. I think our own president is.
You worked on investigations here in New York City, not of the Italian mob, but on basically Russian organized crime that moved in here. In your experience in the FBI, and with other law enforcement officials, when the investigators of the Italian mafia, of Russian organized crime, the investigators of drug dealers, they generally don't like the people they're investigating. Isn't that a fair thing to say when they're investigating drug dealers and mobsters?
That's right. It's a fair generalization.
Right. So,
those
and I
folks are
raise that
engaged in
point.
some
I
pretty
raise
bad
that point
activity.
simply because the president of the United States seems to be suggesting that the only fair way he can be investigated is to be investigated by people who like him. If you don't like him, you cannot fairly investigate him.
I think that's exactly right. I think that it shows just how little this president and his administration, his supporters, understand about the way a democratic government functions. Like, we don't have political tests for government servants in this country. We expect our civil servants, our career government officials, our career professionals to come in and serve every day in a way that's independent of politics. They leave their personal preferences at the door and they dedicate themselves to serving their communities, to serving their country, because they have that sense of purpose. That is what I saw across 21 years of working in the FBI. Men and women who were committed to protecting Americans and upholding the Constitution. Not people who were, checking in as Republicans or Democrats to sort out who would work on which investigation. We have a job to do, and that's protecting America. It's incredibly serious. It's incredibly hard. And we do that by looking at the facts that we uncover in our investigations, the information that comes to us, and making decisions based only on that in terms of who to investigate and where to go next.
And no matter how much you don't like the Russian mobsters you were investigating, you couldn't bring a case against them if you didn't have the evidence, if you couldn't find the evidence. And that's the part the president seems to ignore. The Justice Department issued a response to this book, which they tried to present as some kind of denial of the contents of the book. They don't actually deny a single sentence in the book. It says that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein never authorized any recording that Mr. McCabe references. In your book, you make it very clear that Rod Rosenstein simply discussed the possibility of him volunteering to wear a wire into the Oval Office to record the president, and he's raised that more than once. The book makes it very clear it was never authorized, and it never happened. So that sentence has no meaning in the Justice Department statement. And then it says, on the issue of the 25th Amendment, that you've described serious discussions that Rod Rosenstein participated in, that you participated in, about the possible use of the 25th Amendment to remove the President of the United States. It's never happened before. It would make perfect sense that the Justice Department would have to talk about it, to think it through if it was even how it would be applied. The statement here from Rod Rosenstein says that there is no basis to invoke the 25th Amendment, nor was Rod Rosenstein in a position to consider invoking the 25th Amendment. We know he wasn't. He wasn't a member of the cabinet. You have to be the vice president or a member of the cabinet. You never have suggested that Rod Rosenstein was in a position to invoke the 25th Amendment. And so what you have said is he participated in very serious discussions of it more than once, and that he more than once participated in discussions and led discussions of should he wear a wire into the Oval Office.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. I've read that statement. It is very carefully worded, and I don't think that there's anything in that statement that contradicts the statements that I've made in my book. I would caution you, though, Rod's comments about the 25th Amendment were strictly that. They were comments off the top of his head in the course of wide-ranging, frenetic, and emotionally charged conversations about a lot of things. They were remarkable to me in a way simply that noted, like, look at where we are. Look at the sorts of things that we are having to think about and discuss and walk through simply because we're confronting the issue that our own president may have obstructed justice and may be a threat to national security.
Well, watching this president from here, I discussed the 25th Amendment at the end of the first month of the Trump presidency. So, but let me just ask one more thing about it before we have to squeeze in a break here. And could you possibly stay, because I want to ask you about the one thing that has been denied is the president has denied saying anything negative about your wife ever. And if you can stay after this break, I'd like to ask you about that.
Sure.
But on this 25th Amendment, you've talked about the possibility. Rod Rosenstein was talking about maybe counting votes in the cabinet because you need a majority of the cabinet. Did he name any names who might be willing to vote to remove the president?
I don't remember specific names. The conversation, as I noted, took place quite some time ago, and it was under not the best circumstances. What I think is most important to remember, I never had any sense that Rod was actually taking action on that discussion. I never had any sense that Rod had interacted with other people and was actually marshaling support for the idea. He was simply kind of riffing off the top of his head about how he thought the whole thing could potentially fall out.
Yeah, in the 25th Amendment, the whole process begins with the vice president. So until you're in the discussion of who goes to the vice president, you're not in the real discussion.
You're not there.
And
That's
so,
right.
as far as I can tell, Rod Rosenstein's statement agrees totally with what you've presented on that so far. When we come back, I want to read you what the president said about your wife today and get your reaction to that. We'll be right back. We are back for a final few minutes with Andrew McCabe. And today, the president tweeted, "I never said anything bad about Andrew McCabe's wife other than they should not have taken large amounts of campaign money from a crooked Hillary source when Clinton was under investigation by the FBI. I never called his wife a loser to him. Another McCabe made-up lie."
Absolutely false. Absolutely false on so many counts. I think we don't have to go far to look at the horrendous, and slanderous, and defamatory things that this president has said about my wife, going back to October of 2016. There's a long and illustrious history there. He brought her up in his comments to the press conference he gave at the United Nations. I mean, think of that. Think of, imagine you're my wife driving home from work and that's what you hear reported on the news. It's just been utterly horrible. And with respect to the comments that he made in the telephone conversation that we had the morning after Jim Comey was fired, as I relate in the book, I was not the only person in my office at that time. And I hung up the phone, turned to the people who were sitting there and had listened to my half of the conversation and just said, "You are not going to believe this," and related to them exactly what had happened. So if this preposterous suggestion were true, I would have had to have made that up literally in the call with him in that moment on May 10th, 2017. It's just ridiculous.
Donald Trump insulted your wife, insulted her in very personal terms to you. Do you hate this guy?
Wow, that's a really tough question. I'm going to have to say no. I didn't think of it that way. I really hated the things that he was saying about my wife. I'm not going to lie to you. That is incredibly hard to hear. It's incredibly hard not to react to in the way that any man wants to defend his wife. But honestly, in that moment, I couldn't give myself the luxury of wallowing in that kind of hate. I had a job to do, and 37,000 employees I was responsible for, whose job is to protect America and uphold the Constitution. I couldn't afford to get in a insult trading match with the President of the United States. As absurd as that even sounds, I can't believe I just said it.
Well, I got to say, for readers of the book, you're going to find that very credible because what you have in here throughout the book, and this book is about a lot more than Donald Trump. It is about the Boston Marathon bombing investigation, which I found very moving and fascinating and disturbing. And you spent the entire time of that investigation at FBI headquarters until the suspects were chased down. The compartmentalization, you talk about your own personal, emotional compartmentalization, about dealing with things like that, about watching the video of a child blown up and destroyed in the Boston Marathon bombing. You had to watch it repeatedly looking for clues. And you talk about the compartmentalization it takes to do that. It seems to me that's what you must have been bringing to that kind of moment with Donald Trump talking about your wife.
It is. And, Lawrence, I have to say that in that respect, I am no different than all of the other men and women who serve in that organization. That's the kind of thing that they do every day. That's the kind of stress and situations that they put themselves through, the danger every single day in and day out to protect this nation. I knew with this book, I had the opportunity to give the American public the rare chance to peek behind the FBI curtain, to understand who does this work, why do we do it, and how do we do it? How do we make these decisions? How do we decide where this incredible organization is going to go and what we're going to do? It's not the story that you've heard from the president. It is not the story that you've heard from his supporters on the Hill. It is the actual story of how work is done in an institution that is crucial to the health of this democracy.
The book is, the New York Times review of the book says that it's well written, which it is. And I think one of the great writing challenges of the book is that the word stupid never appears. You have many passages where you could just shorthand it to stupid. This is one of them. You talk about Jeff Sessions, and he's talking about the FBI. And he says, back in the old days, he said, you all only hired Irishmen. They were drunks, but they could be trusted, not like all those new people with nose rings and tattoos. Who knows what they're doing? Did you raise your hand and say, General, I am Irish?
You know, I thought with a name like McCabe, that was fairly self-evident, but
not to Jeff Sessions.
Apparently not. You know, Lawrence, in these moments, we'd be sitting in a small room, a skiff, protected for top secret discussions. A very small group of people, senior leadership of the Bureau, senior leadership of DOJ. When the Attorney General would make remarks like this, it was silence. We wouldn't react. We just kind of stare at him. I mean, I personally never wanted to indicate any sort of agreement. Mm-hmm. We needed to just try to push on and try to get him focused on the work that we were doing at the table. But it was incredibly odd and awkward.
And there's a steady stream of these kinds of things from Jeff Sessions in the book. Your wife, at the end of a long day, described in this book, says to you, you did your job, your kids know it, that's what matters. Is that what you carry forward? Absolutely.
Absolutely. I am so proud of my wife and my children for having gone through this experience. It's just been, it's been so hard on so many different levels. And they are strong, independent, clear-eyed, well-informed people. You know, all families go through struggles. All families have tough things that they have to suffer with. So we're no different in that way. But like all those families, we've become closer and stronger as a result of it.
I have tried to squeeze 3 hours of questions into this half hour.
Done a hell of a job.
That's the best we could do. Look, I know others have talked to you about the Inspector General's report and how you left the FBI. One of the reasons I haven't done that is I've seen your other interviews, and there's a lot about that you can't discuss because you said that's going to be part of a lawsuit. I think those are all worthy areas of inquiry, but in the time I had, I wanted to get into these things that are in this book, which the Times is right. It is well written. It is a quick read, and I learned stunning things on every page. Andrew McCabe,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Really appreciate it, Lawrence.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And when we come back, we will have some reaction to what we've just learned here tonight. We have a panel of guests who will join us. Neil Katyal is here, and others. To discuss what we've just heard from Andrew McCabe, we are joined now by Neil Katyal, former acting Solicitor General of the United States. He's a veteran of the Obama Justice Department and the Clinton Justice Department. Barbara McQuaid is with us. She's a former U.S. attorney and an MSNBC legal contributor. And Natasha Bertrand is a staff writer at The Atlantic covering national security and the intelligence community. She recently interviewed Andrew McCabe herself about his book. And Neil Katyal, I'd like to start with you. And I'd like to point you to the Gang of Eight meeting, but you're free to react to anything else that Andrew McCabe talked about. I actually made a mistake when I said that Kevin McCarthy was in the room for the Gang of Eight. He's a member of the Gang of Eight now, but he wasn't then. But the important point that I heard from Andrew McCabe is after announcing to Democrats and Republican leadership in the Congress that the FBI had launched an investigation of the President of the United States. None of them had any real questions about it. None of them raised any doubts about why the FBI would be investigating the President of the United States.
Yeah, I'll let Natasha speak to the particulars because she's an expert on that. But I think what that story and what McCabe said today and what the New York Times reported today in an extensive article together all have the same theme, which is Donald Trump is engaged in a direct assault on the rule of law. And, I think the public sometimes gets a little bit tired of that. There's almost a fatigue like, oh, that's not new. We've heard that before. And I think the most important thing coming out of today's events, including your great interview, is we can't think that way. Prosecutors and the public don't say when there's a serial murderer, oh, he did it before. You look at each thing individually and you see the pattern that's developed, and here the stories together show Trump is engaged effectively in a serial murder of the Constitution and rule of law. I mean, he fires anyone who's investigating him that wants to seek the truth, whether it's McCabe or whether it's Comey or even Jeffrey Sessions. He puts in place, constitutional jokes like Matthew Whitaker. He tries to discredit and destroy investigations, kind of unrecusing people like Jeff Sessions and now today the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York in the New York Times story. He dangles pardons at people who will testify in favor of him, potentially lying to help him out. He criticizes those who disagree with him, calls them rats and the like. He declares national emergencies without warrant. He discredits judges. Altogether, this is someone who is unfit to discharge his duties as our chief executive officer.
Barbara McQuaid, your reaction to what you heard from Andrew McCabe tonight?
I thought a real service was done to the American public by seeing an interview in such a long form. We got to see, 40 minutes or so of Andrew McCabe. And to the extent his credibility has been in question, and it has been a little bit for me, we had the Inspector General find that he lacked candor and lied under oath. And so I've wondered a little bit about his credibility. And when we see it, not in a 60 Minutes fashion where it's an edited piece, but this, sort of unedited live interview, I think the American public can see for themselves whether he has credibility. And I found that he did. He doesn't push too far. It's the things that a prosecutor or investigator looks for. He doesn't tell the most fabulous story he can. He doesn't tell the story that makes him look the best, makes him look the strongest. He admits to flaws and things. And so I find his story to be very credible. And just to pick up on Neil's point, it really makes me very sad to see these dedicated public servants like Andrew McCabe, like Jim Comey, and others berated and worn down by President Trump. And so I think it's wonderful that the American people get to see him tell his story. And you hope at some point the tide turns and that those who are clinging and believing what President Trump is saying will at some point realize that what he's saying is just not true.
Yeah, and Natasha, I mean, to Neil's point about how weary everyone is, I mean, we even have weary readers of this book because so many people have ignored. There's a passage in there that we talked about here where basically the president says, I believe Vladimir Putin and North Korea doesn't have those missiles. And the very next thing that the president says is he would like to have a war with Venezuela. And people are so weary in collecting this information on President Trump and these crazy statements and dangerous statements by the president that was ignored to the point where I could bring it up tonight as a fresh point with Andrew McCabe.
Right. And I think that Andrew McCabe is such a measured person when you're interviewing him, when he's speaking, that sometimes his points don't come across as alarmist as they probably should. I mean, things like in the book where he does describe how this FBI official was kind of distraught over this conversation that he had with the president where Trump said that he believed Putin. I mean, when I was in the room with McCabe, I mean, he acted out that scene. He said the FBI official looked at his hands. He was totally at a loss for words. He was just sad. It was a really sad day for everyone in the room because they felt like they could not effectively convey intelligence to this president, that this was someone who they were just not going to get through to. But one of the things that really struck me about the interview is when he said that he really did not have the luxury of wallowing in hate after Jim Comey was fired because he had an organization to run. And it's a criticism I've seen of him and of others who have since left the department or who have since left the FBI, and who are more forcefully critical of the president than perhaps they were when they were in these positions. And I think that getting his explanation for that, both in my interview with him and on your interview tonight, is really important because he had to keep the FBI together and running at this very chaotic moment. He was overseeing all of the FBI's operations. He was overseeing an investigation into the president. And he realized that provoking a fight with the president of the United States at that moment was not going to be productive for anyone. And he was very, very forceful tonight when he defended his wife against the president's attacks and when he said pretty much that the president is a liar and that he was completely lying when he said that he had never spoken badly about McCabe's wife. And so I feel like that combined with, McCabe compared Trump to the leader of a criminal enterprise. He has compared him to the head of a mafia family. These are all points that Andy is making that are very, very strong and that I think are going to convince the American public that he is a reliable narrator in all this.
And Neil Katyal, Andrew McCabe goes to extreme lengths to be as precise as he can in his descriptions. He talks about Jeff Sessions and President Trump, both of them having the inability to process intelligence information or to even care about it. And he says it may be that both these men don't understand the importance of this information or don't understand how it is different from other information. That sounds like a report card for a first grader.
Yeah, it's really scary. I mean, and also in that interview is the statement, Trump saying with respect to missiles, I don't believe the intelligence community, I believe Putin. And this is frightening stuff. And I think Barbara's right. There are some credibility issues when it comes to Andrew McCabe, in some of the things he said. But